Escaping from a rich but cruel husband, a mother and her child bought an old house and changed their lives.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
No, I absolutely have to leave. Seeing Michael's smug face every day would be unbearable, Julia thought as she made her final decision. To escape into the unknown with her son, Juan, whom Michael had never accepted. She quit her job, packed her belongings, and left the city in haste, with Michael unaware of their destination. The only person she trusted enough to confide in was her best friend, Pauline, to avoid unnecessary worry about her sudden disappearance. Now, with Juan, they were on an intercity bus, listening to the steady hum of the engine. When the bus driver noticed the young woman struggling to fit a huge yellow suitcase into the aisle, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. A boy, about 8 years old, looking somewhat anxious, obediently followed her. The driver considered suggesting Julia store the suitcase in the luggage compartment, but she politely declined, explaining they'd be getting off at a roadside stop rather than the main terminal. They're heading to some village, but you couldn't tell by looking at them. They're definitely city folks, thought the driver as he helped her with the suitcase. For some inexplicable reason, he sensed immediately that Julia was running away from her problems by changing her surroundings, so he refrained from asking further questions. Instead, for the rest of the journey, the driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of the beautiful yet somewhat melancholic woman. Ah, if I were 20 years younger, I'd definitely take my chances with her, he thought with a smile before turning his focus back to the road ahead. Outside the window, vast fields and occasional patches of forest drifted by, unnoticed by Julia. She had fallen asleep, only waking up when the bus jerked to a reluctant stop at their stop. "Mom, wake up, we've arrived," Juan whispered as he gently shook her shoulder. Julia opened her eyes and immediately saw the old, crooked bus stop leaning to one side. "Right, we've arrived. I fell asleep. I really am a sleepyhead," she muttered in embarrassment as she struggled to pull her yellow suitcase toward the door. Luckily, another passenger helped her. Juan looked around the deserted stop and sighed in disappointment. "Mom, isn't anyone coming to pick us up? Do we still have a long walk to the village?" Sensing her son's worry, Julia smiled. "Don't worry, my love. We won't have to walk. I'll call the agent, and he'll drive us there." "Oh, that's good then." Julia took her phone from her bag and dialed a number. The agent's name was Charles, a typical representative of his trade, always looking to make a profit from the price difference between what the homeowner wanted and what he could arrange. Charles was a young man, perpetually anxious, with shifty eyes and restless movements. From the beginning, Juan hadn't liked him, even though Charles picked them up at the bus stop and drove them to the village. Charles's car was dirty inside and out. As Julia got in, her pants immediately picked up some grime, the same pants she'd worn for this rushed journey. Charles started the engine, and the car sped off like a bullet. He remained silent the entire way, focusing only on avoiding potholes and rough stretches of road. The village greeted them with cautious glances. Dogs barked loudly, and the villagers looked at the newcomers with wary, scrutinizing eyes. Finally, Charles stopped in front of a house that looked fairly sturdy, though its exterior was in dire need of a new coat of paint and some plaster repairs. "We've arrived. As you can see, this isn't a bad house at all, and the price is much lower than the market," the agent declared with an expert tone. Julia got out of the car and approached the gate, which, oddly enough, wasn't locked. She carefully touched it, and it creaked as she opened it, revealing a yard overgrown with weeds. Charles obediently followed, along with Juan, who looked visibly disappointed. Deep down, the boy had imagined something different, but instead, he stood before a large but shabby house that seemed straight out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Still, Julia didn't mind the house's appearance. What mattered to her was the price and a roof over her and her sons' heads. Repairs could be made later. Happiness and beauty come from within, she reminded herself. Meanwhile, the agent began rambling about how this house was a bargain and a smart investment. But what about the owner? Who owns this house? Julia asked, voicing a question that had been bothering her. Charles immediately hesitated, lowering his gaze. Well, the owner. Julia continued questioning him with a determined look, causing an odd silence to blanket the entire yard. Suddenly, the door of the house creaked open. Julia, Charles, and Juan turned to look and saw a frail elderly man step out. "I am the owner of this house," the strange man said. "Perhaps Charles didn't tell you, but I'll sell this house to you very cheaply." Very cheaply, but with one condition. His words made Charles wince as if in pain. Julia immediately turned to the agent with a sharp look that seemed to say, "What is this? Explain yourself, little bird, are you and the owner setting up some kind of scheme?" But since Charles remained silent, Julia turned back to the homeowner and asked, "What's the condition?" Instead of answering immediately, the old man began to cough violently. After wiping his mouth with a handkerchief, he finally spoke up. "I'll sell you this house if you let me stay here for 6 months, maybe a year. I won't bother you. I'll stay in the farthest room, and if you give me a bowl of soup now and then, I'd appreciate it, but I can manage on my own. I'm used to it." Julia gasped in surprise, just as Charles quickly interjected. "Don't be so quick to say no, Julia. Mr. Nicholas here is very ill. The doctors have said he has only 6 months left to live, at most a year." Julia raised her eyebrows, skeptical. "Why didn't you tell me this from the start? What now? Am I supposed to pack up and leave with this gigantic suitcase?" Charles's face flushed from the roots of his hair to the top of his head. Realizing the house sale was at risk of falling apart, he didn't want to say anything that might make things worse. Fortunately, Nicholas stepped in, calmly saying, "Don't hesitate. You can look at my medical reports. All the tests show clear results. With this illness, people don't live long. It's a fact. And this house is good, it just needs a little fixing. A coat of paint, a roof repair, and you'll live as comfortably as anyone." Still uncertain, Julia looked at her son for support. Juan thought for a moment, then said, "Mom, buy it. I don't want to go back, and the old man seems nice." Juan's innocent words made everyone laugh, breaking the tension in the air. "Kids always speak the truth," Nicholas chuckled. Julia gazed off thoughtfully, then sighed. All right. I agree, but I don't think we can complete the sale today. If possible, my son and I will stay in the house overnight, and tomorrow morning we'll go to the notary office. Is that okay?" Julia softened her tone. The agent breathed a sigh of relief and immediately agreed. "That sounds great. By the way, let me offer you some tea. After all, legally, the house is still mine today, so I have the right to play the hospitable host." Nicholas smiled as he made the offer. "Agreed," Juan chimed in. "Oh, if there are any snacks, that'd be awesome, my stomach's growling." The old man smiled contentedly and led them into the kitchen. Julia dragged her suitcase and followed, realizing there was no turning back now, especially after Michael, her husband, had betrayed her and their family for a beautiful mistress. The house carried a faint scent of herbs and something unfamiliar that Julia hadn't smelled before. Perhaps every home in the countryside has its unique aroma, reflecting the lives of its residents. As Julia would soon learn, Nicholas was very knowledgeable about herbs and often treated himself with various herbal infusions and distilled tinctures. Sitting on an old chair, Julia lifted a fragrant cup of herbal tea and took a sip. Her eyes drifted down to the suitcase at her feet, and she felt the weight of realization that her life would never be the same again, all because of her husband, Michael. A businessman, he had decided to make his life more exciting with a new affair. Julia was grateful that she had never taken Michael's last name when they married, at least that spared her from further humiliation. In the past, she had heard rumors of Michael's infidelity but had never believed them. Gossip was common, especially since Michael was so successful in business, and his competitors were always looking for ways to bring him down. Julia had understood that and dismissed his frequent business trips as part of the job. Even her best friend, Pauline, had hinted at Michael's unfaithfulness. "Julia, how can you be so naive? Men, without someone to keep them in line, will eventually get bored and stray, especially when you haven't tied him down with a child." Julia frowned, recalling that. She had always felt uncomfortable whenever someone mentioned that Juan was adopted, especially when they implied he wasn't really her son. Julia had snapped at Pauline more than once over this issue. "What does that have to do with anything? Why should I have to tie Michael down by getting pregnant? You know I have fertility issues. We tried many times, but it was all in vain." Pauline would only laugh knowingly, as if she knew more than she let on. At the time, Julia hadn't understood her friend's insinuation, but later, everything became painfully clear. As a doctor in the therapy department, Julia was utterly devoted to her patients, always considering their treatment her top priority. But that didn't mean she neglected her family. On the contrary, as soon as she crossed the threshold of her home, she became the perfect homemaker, a loyal wife, and a loving mother. But Michael was different. Even when he was home, he was always busy with work. Michael reluctantly agreed to adopt a child from the orphanage, but he never truly wanted one. He only did it because Julia insisted. "Michael, I can't go on without a child. It's unimaginable for me," Julia would often say, trying to stir some fatherly feelings in him. But Michael would brush it off. Sensing her husband's coldness and lack of understanding, Julia would bury her face in her pillow each night and cry quietly. Eventually, Michael gave in, though begrudgingly. He didn't care about the paperwork or the adoption process, leaving all the administrative tasks to Julia. Between shifts at the hospital, she hurried to the orphanage, talking to caretakers and staff, reviewing files, and looking at photos of children with tear-filled eyes. If she could, she would have adopted them all, boys, girls, any orphan child without distinction. She dreamed of building a large 3-story home with playrooms, sports courts, and even a swimming pool. Listening to the orphanage director's explanations, Julia couldn't help but feel the pain and tragic circumstances that had brought these children to the orphanage. Each child's story filled her with wonder and sorrow. Juan's parents had died in a car accident when he was not even a year old. In truth, no one was entirely at fault in the accident. One driver misjudged the speed and drifted into the other lane while trying to overtake another vehicle, and the oncoming driver reacted too slowly. The collision happened, glass shattered, and the smoking wreck on the roadside led to tragedy. Juan was only spared because he had been with his grandmother, who passed away just a month and a half after losing her daughter and son-in-law. That was when the boy ended up in the orphanage, joining other children with similarly heartbreaking stories. Julia couldn't explain exactly why she chose Juan. Perhaps it was something instinctive. The moment she saw the boy's sky-blue eyes, she loved him instantly. Michael, however, reacted indifferently to her choice. "All right then, you've picked one, so that's it. Now you can take care of him, just don't bother me. You know I have a monumental deal coming up," Michael said. Julia nodded silently, agreeing with every word. After all, it was her idea, and she had to make her dream a reality. But things didn't go as she'd hoped. One night, Julia's hospital shift was cancelled, and she returned home earlier than expected. On her way, she stopped at a shop to buy a bottle of wine, a box of chocolates, and some vanilla-scented candles. Her heart was light with excitement, because it wasn't every day she could surprise her husband and son. But things didn't go as planned. The moment she crossed the threshold of her home, she heard voices, a man's and a woman's. One was her husband Michael's voice, but the other was unfamiliar. Then Julia saw a pair of women's shoes in the hallway and understood everything without having to ask. Michael's romantic murmurings echoed like an obsessive peacock, accompanied by the giggles of the woman who had seduced the promising businessman. Julia's dreams of a happy family shattered. With trembling legs, she took a few steps toward the bedroom. What she saw left her utterly shocked. Michael lay in the arms of his lover on the very bed they had shared, lost in dreams of a future together. When Michael saw Julia standing at the door, his face went pale with shock. "Wait, it's not what you think. I can explain everything, really," he stammered. Julia gritted her teeth in bitterness. "Oh, really? And what's this? Do you really think I'm an idiot? Do you think I don't see what's going on here?" Michael's lover was an attractive brunette with the smugness of a skilled manipulator. She wasn't fazed by the wife's presence, even beginning to put her clothes back on, using Julia's own bathrobe. Julia felt disgusted by the woman's audacity, but at the same time, she knew the real fault lay with her husband, who had allowed this to happen. At that moment, Julia was worried about something else. Where was Juan? She later found out that Michael had deliberately sent their son to his mother's apartment downtown. Marta had never liked Juan, always seeing him as the child of a nobody and a hopeless drunk, despite having no evidence to support such accusations. In fact, Julia had done her own investigation and knew that Juan's parents were good people, not wealthy, but very caring and with big dreams for their son's future. Slamming the door shut, Julia left the house and went straight to her mother-in-law's place. Marta hadn't liked her from the beginning. She was a harsh woman, full of resentment toward the world. She wanted her daughter-in-law to be as wealthy as an oil heiress and as beautiful as a Miss World contestant, even though Michael wasn't exactly the epitome of masculinity, with his slightly hunched posture and balding head. When Marta saw her angry daughter-in-law standing at the door, she smirked with a knowing look. "Finally here to pick up your kid? Take him away. He's sitting in the kitchen. And one more thing, don't leave him with me again. I don't know what's going on between you and Michael, but I don't want to be stuck looking after that stray child anymore." Julia pursed her lips in anger. "Who told you he's a stray? He's just an orphan. His parents died in a car accident. It's really unkind of you to call him that." Marta waved dismissively. "Don't mind my words. You know that bad blood can't be hidden. Whether his parents died in an accident or not, I'm sure they were drunks, and maybe that's why the accident happened. He'll turn out the same, just wait and see." "I think I can manage without your advice," Julia replied coldly before telling Juan, who looked bewildered, to get dressed quickly. In just a few minutes, mother and son said their polite goodbyes and disappeared into the thick night. That night, they stayed at Pauline's house, and the next morning, Julia began to think about what she would do next. The decision to leave the city came suddenly, driven by the desire to never have to see her husband's smug face again, the man who thought he could control everyone's lives as he pleased. Only now did Julia fully understand that Michael had been deceiving her all along and that the rumors of his infidelity were true. "They told me he was a philanderer, but I didn't believe it. Now look at what I've gotten," she said bitterly over breakfast the next morning. Pauline nodded sympathetically, then asked, "So, what are you going to do? Will you file for divorce? That might be the best option in your situation. You could even win something from him in court." Julia shook her head. "No, I won't file a lawsuit, at least not yet. Honestly, I don't want anything more to do with that liar. What would I gain in court? Michael isn't Juan's biological father, so I can't ask for child support, and as for fighting over his worthless company, let him suffocate in it." Pauline raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You can't be serious. Are you really going to let him get away with cheating and just walk away from his life like nothing happened? No way, he has to pay for all the years you gave him." Tears glistened in Julia's eyes. "I understand, Pauline, I really do. But I don't have the strength. The thought of facing him in court exhausts me. Maybe later, when I'm calmer, I'll find the strength to file a lawsuit, but right now, I just want to change my life." "And what about your job? You're doing so well at the clinic. Are you really planning to give up everything and chase some uncertain happiness? Pauline pressed. Julia looked at her friend, eyes full of tears. I'll quit. I can't live in the same city as Michael anymore. I've just realized that all along, people in his business circle and even some of my colleagues knew he was cheating, but no one told me. They laughed behind my back. I've already started looking at real estate ads somewhere far away. I'll find a job at a small clinic or work with an emergency service. A good doctor is needed everywhere, and I consider myself one. I'm sure I won't be unemployed. Besides, Juan will love it. He's always dreamed of going to the forest, fishing, but Michael never had the time, always meetings, business trips, or taking care of his girlfriends. Pauline looked at her friend with sympathy, then reached into her purse and offered Julia some money for the road, but Julia firmly refused. No, thank you, Pauline. I don't need it yet. I've saved a bit. I was hoping to buy a small house by the river, near the forest, with mushrooms and wild berries. But every time I brought it up to Michael, he'd object, making excuses about allergies or a fear of ticks. Pauline laughed. Afraid of ticks? He should be more afraid of his girlfriends. He thinks the whole world revolves around him. Later that day, ignoring Michael's incessant calls, Julia quit her job at the clinic and began searching for a new place to live. She spent the entire day browsing through newspapers and real estate websites. Finally, a modest ad in a newspaper caught her attention. A house for sale in a small village. For some reason, Julia immediately knew this was her chance, an opportunity she couldn't pass up. Only once she sat in Nicholas's small kitchen did she realize things hadn't gone according to plan. But she also had no other choice. Where else could she go now? Return to the city with a huge suitcase and a child, admit defeat, and try to get her old job back as if nothing had happened? No, Julia knew she had burned all her bridges, so she had to accept Nicholas's presence, a man who, it turned out, wasn't as bad as she initially thought. Seeing his client looking satisfied, Charles quickly arranged another meeting for the next morning and rose from the table. All right then, I'll see you tomorrow, Julia. I'll be happy to meet you again. Now just relax and settle in, Charles said. Julia smiled slightly and nodded. Most of the time, the idea of living with an old man like Nicholas didn't stir any fear or insecurity in her. In Nicholas's eyes, she saw that life had been hard on him, and now he just wanted to spend his last days in his beloved home. After Charles left, Julia carefully asked Nicholas the question that had haunted her for so long. Why don't you leave this house to family through a will? Why sell it? Don't you have any heirs? The old man shook his head. Heirs? What heirs, Julia? My son passed away, and then my grandson followed years later. My grandson went off to work and disappeared somewhere. They returned his body to me in a zinc coffin from the battlefield. Of course, I grieved, but I still had to bury him. David, my grandson, worked in the mines, and there was a collapse. Half the workers were buried, including him. How did your grandson leave an inheritance to you? Julia asked in surprise. Nicholas shook his head again, explaining. My grandson and I had a unique insurance plan. He didn't know about my arrangement, and I didn't know about his, but in the end, we left the house to each other in our wills. We were the only true owners of this place, so both of us prepared for the worst. If I'd died first, my grandson would inherit the house, but since he's gone, the house reverted back to me, and now I want to sell it to you. Not for profit, but because I want to use the money to repair the village school. I taught there for 40 years. Of course, this money won't be enough to fix the whole school, but at least we can replace the roof and repaint the front. Maybe another sponsor will come forward later. They're planning to close the school and move the kids to the district center, but it's more than 10 kilometers away. Julia looked at the kind old man with respect. He truly was a good person, caring more about the village children than himself, although Julia thought he also needed help. After a brief hesitation, Julia asked, "And what about treatment? The doctors must have suggested something, perhaps some kind of therapy." Nicholas sighed sorrowfully. "They did, but I still believe in my herbal remedies. I don't trust those pills. I know I don't have long left, so don't misunderstand, but I'll use the money to fix the school. I don't need it. Money only brings trouble. To be honest, I'd give you the house for free if I could. I understand how hard life must be for you with a child, but the children in this village need help too. How can they go without a school? There's also a commemorative plaque dedicated to my son, who died in a fire, set up to honor him. He was a real firefighter, with sirens and everything, right?" Juan, who had been quietly listening to his mother and the old man, chimed in. Nicholas wiped a tear from his eye. "Yes, that's right, in a real fire truck. He lived nearby and rode an old bike to work every day since he didn't have a car. He'd bike about 20 kilometers back and forth, and he'd travel around the area for his work, too. That was my son, Louis, and my grandson, David, was even better. But now, what's the point of talking about it?" At that moment, Julia felt deep sympathy for the elderly man, left alone to face an incurable illness. After unpacking, she and her son chose a room in the house where they would stay during their time here. Nicholas kept his promise and tried not to disturb his new tenants. The next morning, Julia, who loved cleanliness, started tidying up. She mixed well water with bleach and cleaning supplies and got to work. She washed the windows, swept out cobwebs from the corners, and then mopped the floors. Finally, she went outside with Juan to tackle the ever-present weeds. In some places, the grass reached waist-high, making the task very challenging. "Where did all these weeds come from, Mom? We've been fighting them for hours, and they don't seem to care," Juan said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Julia smiled. "You wanted to try rural life, didn't you? Well, here's your answer. Your grandmother lived in a village too, before her house burned down." "Mom, could Nicholas really die?" "I don't want him to die. He's amazing, he tells so many interesting stories and knows so much," Juan asked, worry evident in his voice. Tears welled up in Julia's eyes. What could she say to her son now? That this kind old man was destined to die, and no one could save him. On the other hand, Julia wanted to look into the diagnosis given by the doctors at the district center. While Julia and Juan were busy in the yard, Nicholas unexpectedly prepared a simple dinner of a dozen fried eggs and a fresh cabbage salad. "Here, my dears, eat up, there's enough for 3. Every time I look at you two, my heart breaks. You're so thin, not like country folk at all. Don't mind me, it's just that this illness has drained me. I used to be a big man, you know, the kind they say is built like a bull." Nicholas's words made Julia smile gently. The next morning, Julia got up early and went to the district center to sort out her work situation. She arranged to meet Charles by phone, who would take her to the notary's office to finalize the house purchase. Since Nicholas had already signed where needed, they didn't bring him to the city due to his age and health. Instead, the grandpa stayed with Juan, promising to take him to the river. Meanwhile, Michael was racking his brain over what to do next. He wasn't in a rush to divorce his wife because he had special plans for her. His lover, Camila, was mostly there to satisfy his emotional and physical needs rather than provide any practical benefits. However, in candid conversations with Camila, Michael had confessed his intention to use Julia for his dark purposes. "You're so mysterious. Is there something I don't know?" Camila asked, smiling seductively. Michael paused for dramatic effect before revealing his plan. "Actually, here's what we're going to do, Camila. I'm in serious trouble in business, almost bankrupt. You get that, right? But I haven't told anyone about it. I want to push Julia to divorce on my terms, then transfer the company to her. I'll play the role of a noble knight, saying that I've accepted a child that's not my own and am now ready to give up everything in the divorce. Camilla smirked knowingly. Then you'll leave her with a company drowning in debt, won't you? Exactly. Camilla, I've always said you should be an economist, even if you don't have the official credentials. But hey, life is full of surprises. Of course, Julia knew nothing about any of this. How could she, especially when she thought she'd never have to see her unfaithful husband again? Moreover, she was in no hurry to file for divorce. She wanted to first regain her balance, find her peace, and only then face her unfaithful husband in court. After completing the house purchase, Julia handed Nicholas the money in an envelope that same day, sincerely thanking him for his help. "Oh, dear, I already feel guilty, as if I'm taking the last of your money and wands. Please forgive me, but I'm not keeping this for myself, I'll give it to the school principal right away." Julia nodded, smiling to herself. The trip to the city that day hadn't been in vain. Not only had she learned more about Nicholas's diagnosis, but she'd also spoken with the local head of the therapy department about job opportunities. Surprisingly, the department, managed by Javier, was in need of an experienced doctor, and during the interview, the department head looked at Julia with eager anticipation, as if she were a beacon of science from one of the country's best medical facilities. It turned out that Nicholas had been diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer by none other than Javier, who had told him exactly how much time he had left. When Julia brought up this topic with the head doctor, she was shocked by his bluntness. "You know, Julia, we don't lie to patients here. I'm no fool, I understand everything. I've reviewed the X-rays and test results, evaluated the situation, and informed him of the estimated time left, so he could think clearly and not cling to unrealistic hopes. Otherwise, the house would be left unattended, with no one to care for it." "What does the house have to do with any of this?" Julia asked, her voice filled with indignation. "Well, the old man didn't make a new will, so if anything were to happen to him, the house would go to the village chief. Fortunately, Nicholas managed to sell it to you in time. Honestly, I wanted that house for myself, but you were quicker. City folks like you are always so sharp, while we country folk take our time celebrating. But you grabbed the opportunity right away." Julia shook her head in disappointment. Javier's approach to patients was clearly cynical and callous. "Julia, I think we'll work well together. You have extensive knowledge, and practical experience is crucial in this field. So, see you tomorrow in the department," the head doctor concluded, extending his hand. Julia shook his hand, then returned home. From the very first day, she had begun to think of Nicholas's house as her own. It was hard to say what influenced her thoughts, perhaps it was like that pure, first love that only happens once in a lifetime. Of course, her feelings were completely innocent, but that didn't change the reality of the situation. Besides, Julia felt something was off with Nicholas's diagnosis. Everything seemed too vague, especially given Javier's unpleasant nature. And why was a therapy doctor so involved in this case? At some point, Julia realized that Javier might be trying to manipulate the situation to take the old man's house for himself, hoping to become its owner. She couldn't be certain, but she suspected that things in the clinic were not as they appeared. So, after settling into her new job, she decided to conduct her own examination of Nicholas, planning to send his tests to the regional hospital for a more thorough review. When Nicholas learned of this, he waved his hand dismissively. "No, my dear, please don't. Why are you even thinking about this? This would only cause more trouble for both the doctors and me as a patient. I trust our therapy doctors, especially Javier. He used to be my student, you know, though he was a bit lazy. But that didn't stop him from becoming department head." Julia shook her head reproachfully. "You're praising him too much. He wasn't a great student, yet now he's supposedly a beacon of medicine in this region." Juan interjected. "Mom, Nicholas and I are going to the river tomorrow. We'll bring our fishing rods and catch some fish. He even promised to take me out on a boat if he's feeling well. Julia looked at the old man with concern. You have to be careful. What if you don't feel well or something happens? Don't worry about Juan's requests, he always wants something, but we can't always accommodate him. Let's get your tests done first, and then we'll all go to the river together. Seeing her son's disappointed face, she softened her tone. All right, little fox, go ahead. But be careful, and keep an eye on Nicholas, okay? Yes, Mom, I'll take care of Mr. Nicholas, the boy replied eagerly, making everyone laugh. Julia found herself enjoying her work at the therapy department in the district. The team was generally strong and cohesive, except for the department head, whom she soon discovered was a fraud in a white coat. According to the nurses, Javier deliberately befriended elderly patients, learning about any property they owned and subtly encouraging them to transfer it to him. While Javier's actions weren't illegal, he was enriching himself by taking advantage of people who believed that transferring assets to him would improve their medical care. In reality, Javier treated everyone the same. This didn't mean he was a bad doctor, his office was filled with awards and certificates, but that didn't stop him from solving his financial issues by exploiting others. Rumor had it that Javier was obsessed with horse racing, where events took place in the summer. He would place large bets, hoping his horse would finish first. Some people even said he tried to bribe jockeys, offering them hefty commissions, but it only led to debt and headaches. Julia knew none of this until about a week later, when all the pieces began falling into place. Ironically, around the same time, Nicholas's test results came back, and they were not as dire as Javier had described. It turned out the old man's condition was treatable with comprehensive medication and wasn't cancer-related at all. If Julia were more cunning, she could have withheld this information to use it as leverage against Javier. But because she was honest and principled, she reported her findings to her superiors the very same day. Javier's face turned pale, and he was visibly anxious. Listen, Julia, I think no one else needs to know about this, okay? Let's keep this between us. If you'd like, I can refund the money for the house to the old man. I mean, I can compensate you. I have money in my account. I've done this real estate thing before. Or, if you prefer, you could partner with me. Don't think I'm greedy, I'm willing to share. Julia looked at Javier with disdain. No, Javier, that's not me. I bought Nicholas's house legitimately and paid him the full amount he asked for. He intends to use this money to repair the school, so I can't accept your money in exchange for silence. I'm sorry, but I'll have to report this to the administration. Javier's face flushed with anger. Do you know what you're doing? You've only been here a week, and you're already investigating internal matters. You think anyone will let you move up the ranks? My advice is to mind your own business, got it? Otherwise, you'll end up in a lot of trouble, and the old man could lose his house in an instant. But Julia wasn't easily intimidated and kept her word. The head doctor of the clinic, Fernando, listened to his new employee patiently, then fell into deep thought. He didn't want to fire Javier, as it would raise another question. Who could replace him? There simply wasn't anyone qualified enough within the clinic. Well, thank you for the warning, Julia. I'll think about what we can do. Don't worry or feel intimidated by Javier's threats. I've known him for a long time. He's generally a competent doctor. For a first offense, we'll try to handle it with a warning and assess the situation further. After all, he is a skilled specialist, Fernando said. Julia felt relieved as she left Fernando's office, realizing that her supervisor was a wise and understanding man. Fernando, likely in his 40s, had noticeable streaks of gray at his temples, intelligent gray eyes, and a warm baritone voice that gave listeners a subtle chill when he spoke. He was never loud, and unlike many senior health officials, he prioritized helping patients over protecting his staff. However, Javier had no intention of staying idle. The schemer quickly realized that after his conversation with the head doctor, nothing good awaited him. So, he began planning a transfer to another medical facility. To make this happen, he decided to contact someone recommended by a patient, a businessman named Michael. Meanwhile, Julia was unaware that her boss was seeking help directly from her unfaithful husband, who was merely waiting for the opportunity to push her into a divorce. After arranging to meet the businessman at his office, Javier placed a luxury order and waited for Michael. The cunning doctor knew that his new acquaintance had connections to the criminal underworld and could solve any problem, though, of course, not for free. Javier was shocked when, during the conversation, he discovered that Julia was Michael's legal wife. He hadn't guessed this, as Julia hadn't taken her husband's last name. Javier assumed it was deliberate. Michael nodded in agreement and looked directly into Javier's eyes. Yes, Julia is stubborn. I even told her before we got married to take my last name. What's there to be embarrassed about? She refused, saying she wanted to keep her name, so I agreed. And look where we are now. Anyway, I need to push her into a divorce, but I don't know how, so I'm counting on your help. An evil glint flickered in Javier's eyes. I think I understand the issue, and I'll do everything I can. Michael gave him a thumbs up. That's right. To speed things along, make Julia's life so difficult that she'll agree to divorce just to escape it. Meanwhile, I'm preparing a little surprise for her, something related to the criminal world. A sly smile crept across Javier's lips. I think we understand each other, Michael. I'll do whatever you need, don't worry. I'm sure Fernando will give me another chance. He's a soft-hearted man. His wife used to run everything before the accident. Soon, I'll have complete control over Julia. After a lengthy conversation and a lavish lunch, the two conspirators shook hands and parted ways as if nothing had happened, each beginning to execute their part of the plan. Michael prepared the necessary documents to transfer his struggling company to his wife, who would receive it as part of the divorce settlement. His plan was simple. Hand over the unprofitable company to his unsuspecting wife, increasing its debts and burdens, then escape with his mistress, Camila, to an island with no extradition laws, out of reach of the authorities. For his part, Javier had his own goals and hoped that, with Michael's connections, he could undermine the head doctor, paving the way for Javier to expand his influence in the department. The therapy department often catered to elderly patients, providing ample opportunity for him to receive gratitude in the form of inheritances or similar perks. While the two schemers carried out their plans, Julia continued with her daily work, doing her best to help her patients, with Nicholas standing out among them. Now, knowing he wasn't terminally ill, a sparkle of joy returned to his eyes. He personally handed the money over to the school principal to repair the roof, receiving a round of applause from the students, who didn't want to have to travel to the district center. Many families lacked personal transportation, and the school bus frequently broke down, causing students to miss classes. The news of an unexpected divorce finally reached Julia. Truthfully, she had never imagined Michael would take the first step. She thought her husband would ignore her and ridicule her, trying to destabilize her, but it turned out to be the opposite. In the divorce petition, Michael admitted his fault to his wife and intended to hand over the company to her as compensation. This left Julia utterly bewildered. My goodness, why would he do that? He could easily give the company to his mistress, so why hand it to me? Has he suddenly developed a sense of fatherly responsibility? No way. He and his mother have always despised Juan, treating him as a burden. Finally, after discussing the matter with Nicholas, she received practical advice from the wise old teacher. I'll say this, you should speak with the head doctor about this, especially since you have a good relationship with him. I spoke with them once and know that Fernando has a brother who's been in business for a long time. I couldn't recommend anyone better, trust me. My heart tells me that this situation isn't as simple as it seems. It's unusual for a husband to offer the company in a divorce. Typically, they try to keep everything for themselves. This appears to be a noble gesture, but a stubborn philanderer handing over his last piece of the pie to his wife, that can't be good. Julia smiled. You're right, I can approach Fernando. He seems trustworthy, especially with a brother who has his own business. He must know about the state of my husband's company. Nicholas nodded, gently patting Julia on the shoulder. The next day, as planned, Julia sought help from Fernando, who was rather surprised by her visit. Internally, he thought that Julia had perhaps uncovered yet another violation at the clinic. However, after listening to her request, his expression changed, and he began to reflect. Well, what you're saying is very interesting, Julia. I'll try my best to help you, but time is short, there isn't much left before the court date. I think your husband deliberately orchestrated everything to keep you from having the chance to analyze the situation properly. My brother, Marco, is knowledgeable and a true expert. I believe he can help uncover what's really going on. Thank you, Fernando. I'm very grateful for your help, Julia said, her face flushing slightly as she left his office. The head doctor watched her leave with a sad gaze, thinking to himself. Julia is genuinely a good person, even though she's from the big city. Since she arrived, the therapy department has transformed before my eyes. Even Javier has toned down his aggression. However, he's still filing complaints, accusing her of negligence. Well, we'll handle that. Of course, Julia had no idea about the betrayal her husband was plotting during this time. Still, none of the doctors were surprised about it, as everyone knew that Julia's only concern now was Nicholas's treatment, which was showing clear signs of improvement. The old man was coughing less in the mornings and felt rejuvenated, almost as if he had a newfound energy. Before long, under Nicholas's direct supervision, repairs began on the high school, with support from the villagers, and the roof was completed in just a few days. Meanwhile, Julia continued her work at the therapy department, hardly thinking about the upcoming divorce, unaware it hit a cunning trap. Fortunately, just before the court date, Fernando called her and said, Julia, I advise you to reject your husband's offer. Do not agree to take over the company under any circumstances. Draft a written refusal and submit it directly to the court. Is it really that serious? Julia asked, skeptical. The head doctor replied. It's very serious. Your husband's company is bankrupt. He's looking for a scapegoat to shoulder all the debt while he flees the country. Julia thanked him once more, surprised at his insight and kindness. The next morning, she prepared thoroughly for the hearing and arrived fully ready. Michael, on the other hand, sat next to his mistress with a gloomy face, feigning sorrow and regret over what had happened. In truth, he wanted to make the judge believe that he was ready to give up everything to beg for forgiveness from his wife and her adopted son. But when it came time for Julia to speak, the bankrupt businessman realized his wife had bested him in every way. I, Julia, publicly declare that I refuse to accept my husband's company and request that it be transferred to the city's real estate fund. I don't need his charity, nor do I request alimony, Julia declared, articulating each word clearly. A round of applause broke out, and shortly afterward, a special investigator hired by Fernando entered the courtroom to conduct an independent investigation into systematic violations within Michael's company. At that moment, Julia's scheming husband realized he had fallen into a trap. The saying, "Don't dig a pit for others," couldn't have been truer, and that's exactly what happened to Michael. Instead of winning the case, he lost everything. Michael faced investigation for embezzling shareholders' funds and creditor debt. Camila, sensing the change, immediately distanced herself from him as if she'd never known him. Meanwhile, Julia walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, her heart filled with joy. She wanted to shout with happiness. Today, she had not only defeated her husband but had also overcome her own fears and insecurities. To everyone's surprise, Fernando was waiting for the newly divorced woman outside the courthouse. The head doctor had loved Julia from the moment he saw her, and Julia recognized this. She responded to his affection not with words but through her gaze and gestures. Only after gaining her freedom could she accept the courtship of a man, becoming Fernando's fiancé and future partner. Back in the village, other events were unfolding. After the school repairs were completed, at the principal's request, Nicholas began teaching students once a week, sharing stories about his life and how he had overcome his illness. Juan, soon to be a student there in the fall, eagerly looked forward to his grandfather's lessons and applauded whenever he heard his warm, comforting voice. With encouragement from her new husband, Julia accepted the position as head of the department, replacing Javier, the corrupt, deceitful doctor. Ironically, Javier, despite his disgrace, didn't face criminal charges because the investigation didn't find criminal intent in his actions. However, fate had its own way of punishing him. After a series of losses, Javier gambled away his own home, finally realizing he'd lost everything. Rumor has it he moved to a big city, living as a wanderer, begging for money, dreaming that one day he'd finally win in a race that seemed to stretch on forever. If you enjoyed this story, please support it with a like and a comment. Wishing you all the best. The story of Julia, Michael, and Nicholas teaches us that resilience and integrity always prevail over deceit and greed. Julia's courage to start over with her son, despite Michael's betrayal, highlights the strength of a determined mother. Nicholas's selflessness shows the importance of prioritizing the greater good, even in personal hardship. Meanwhile, Michael and Javier's downfall is a reminder that dishonesty and manipulation eventually lead to failure. Ultimately, the story encourages us to value honesty, community, and perseverance in the face of adversity.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.